Hi, this is Paul, and I'm continuing my conversation basically about God and ontology and what is reality. Jonathan Peugeot is making some videos now too discussing similar things. He had Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and I might be coming at this from a little different way than he is. We're planning to have a conversation later this month, Jonathan and I, about this. So we're both kind of ramping up and making some videos for it. I'm following the video that I made on God number 1 and God number 2. Now, those aren't different gods. Those are two different definitions of God, and I'm following the tweet. Esther O'Reilly wrote that piece. Sam Harris asks questions Jordan Peterson can't answer, and Peterson tweeted that article and said it's a good article, and it is a good article. And then Gordy Allen said, great read. Instead of belief or non-belief, now the conversation's moved on to a much more interesting question. What do we mean when you say God? And I see the conversation between Peterson and Harris as improving the conversation and bringing us to not only more interesting questions, but better defined questions. And I think we're asking more intelligent questions. For example, is Mickey Mouse real? And I'm using Mickey Mouse because Mickey Mouse isn't in public domain, and most of us know why, because the Disney Corporation finds Mickey Mouse real enough to spend a considerable amount of money keeping Mickey Mouse out of public domain. Our comic superheroes real? And again, same point. Marvel is going to want to keep Iron Man and its whole cast of superheroes in under their protection and within their intellectual property rights for as long as they can, because they are very real indeed for the Marvel Corporation, which now is, the Marvel movies are made, of course, by the Disney Corporation. And so we might ask, is the Disney Corporation real? Well, what do we mean when we talk about God? Well, what did the ancients believe when they talked about a son of God or a son of God? Now, some of you who saw my Sunday school class 2 weeks ago noted that I got into that in my Sunday school class, and I do want to revisit that. Someone left a comment that, or sent me a tweet that I should really do a shorter video on this channel on that, and I'm thinking about it, because actually, if you've been listening to Peterson and you're understanding the way that he's addressing these questions, you can begin to see how these questions are important and how they impact our lives. Now, again, if you go all the way back to the Jordan Peterson conversation, he begins Maps of Meaning by saying there are two ways you can map out reality. Okay, something is real if you can locate it in 3 dimensions, in physical space. These are objects in space, and I've been repeating this quite a bit through my videos. Peterson says something is also real if it impacts human behavior, and I'll often use the example of a marriage. Is a marriage real? Now, a marriage might be borne witness to by a piece of paper, but the piece of paper itself isn't the marriage. The marriage is a relationship. Now, a marriage is not an object in space, but relationships are very real, and they're very strong, and they determine our behavior to a huge degree. If you walk away from your spouse and you say, I'm not married, or I don't want to be married anymore, these kinds of words govern history to a tremendous amount. They have a great deal of power, and this is part of what Peterson is saying. You know, this is a forum for action. So a marriage is real in a way that goes through time and space to a great degree. The marriages of Henry VIII governed and colonized history, the history of England, for a long, long time. Now, would you say that marriage is not real, or your marriage is not real, or your parents' marriage was not real, or Henry VIII's marriages or ordeals regarding marriage were not real? They were very real indeed. They were very powerful, and they governed human history and have changed history to a tremendous degree, even though you cannot find Henry VIII's marriage as an object in space. It is nevertheless real. And this gets into some of what Peterson talks about with this Jungian statement that perhaps we don't have ideas, but ideas have us. These ideas, these non-material realities are powerful indeed, and they govern this world to a tremendous degree. Now, Harris wants to just dispel a lot of this and say this isn't real. Well, is Harris's marriage real? I would dare bet his marriage is very real, even though he can't identify it as an object in space. That non-object reality governs their behaviors. So now we get into Santa Claus, Mickey Mouse, Iron Man. Are they real? Well, how is their reality different from, let's say, Jordan Peterson's reality? Well, they're real enough to change behavior, but we would rightly say Jordan Peterson is real in a different way than Santa Claus, Mickey Mouse, and Iron Man are real. But in illuminating and elucidating the ways that they are different is not terribly easy, because part of the reality, and Jonathan Peugeot gets into this to a certain degree in his video, the image we have in our mind of Jordan Peterson, what is the relationship between that representation and Jordan Peterson himself? What is the relationship between Jordan Peterson located in time and space, let's say here in early August 2018, and the Jordan Peterson that was making videos at Harvard a while ago, or the Jordan Peterson a few years ago before he took his status rocket ride? So is Jordan Peterson a process? To what degree is that Jordan Peterson, the actor in history, more real than the physical manifestation, or the Jordan Peterson that appears on our cell phones and computer screens as a YouTube representation, or the Jordan Peterson that authors this book, 12 Rules for Life? What kind of power does Mickey Mouse have compared with Jordan Peterson? Now, that is not a simple question to answer. Does Mickey Mouse or Jordan Peterson have more power in terms of the Congress of the United States? Who has more lawyers? Well, you might say, well, the Disney Corporation is more real than Mickey Mouse, and the Disney Corporation governs Mickey Mouse. But that just pushes the question back, because Jordan Peterson's reality is different from the Disney Corporation's reality too. The Disney Corporation is not the same as a person, but he's a corporation, and so we get back to Mitt Romney. Corporations are people too. Well, but they're special kinds of people, and they're different kinds of people. So again, you can begin to see why this fundamental assumption that reality is primarily objects in space really doesn't govern that much. You cannot locate the Disney Corporation as an object in space, but it has agency, it has tremendous power. Does it have personhood? Well, it kind of acts like a person, because it colonizes Mickey Mouse and determines that representation. So where is their power located? How is their power manifest? Do they have power, or is their power colonized by persons? The Disney Corporation has a chief executive officer. The Disney Corporation has a board of trustees, and that board of trustees has a process by which they act something like persons. They make decisions, they affect decisions, and these decisions have impact on people all over the world. Now, their CEO is a person more in the way that Jordan Peterson is, but even then, when we begin to look at how they behave and the kinds of power they have, you realize that personhood with respect to being a legal agent is also itself a complicated situation. This conversation we're having about God isn't real because he's not something that I can take a ladder up to and put my hand around, like I could put my hand around Jordan Peterson's wrist is a rather simplistic conversation, because even if when I shook hands with Jordan Peterson, I was holding his hand and shaking his hand, and there was a reality to it, and I could have pulled his arm or punched him in the nose, but the greater reality, the realities that we would have been most interested in, wouldn't actually have been our bodies, even though our bodies would have been engaged. If I had hit him in the face with a pie or punched him in the nose, actually the most interesting realities would have been the relational realities and the actor realities. And these realities, in fact, would have governed a whole bunch of things. If I had punched him in the nose, he could have called the Sacramento police and had me placed under arrest for assaulting him, and on and on and on. And so you very much begin to see that form for action and these realities of actors is in many ways the governing reality that in fact governs, colonizes this meat space, these material creatures that we are. And these relationships are complex, but again, moving the conversation beyond reality or objects in space, and because we cannot find a God, therefore there is no God. And I think Peterson rightly says this is the thinking of a 13-year-old who hasn't thought much about these realities within which we all live. And again, Peterson talks about hierarchies and status, and how our psychology and our brain chemistry is deeply attuned to hierarchies and realities. In fact, almost all of the social war conversations that we're having right now is about realities. Patriarchy. Is there something in terms of maleness and femaleness that makes them asymmetrical? Or equality. And so, almost all of our conversations right now are dealing with relationships. They're not so much dealing with these material objects, even though these material objects are obviously also deeply ingrained in the picture. If I decide to plagiarize Mickey Mouse, and if I do so in a determined fashion, and if I refuse to pay the fines that the courts will levy against me, they will take possession of my material person and put me in prison. I'm currently sitting within a locked building. Am I in prison? Well, again, it's all of the realities and all of the social relationships that actually differentiate this church building that's sitting on a particular corner in Sacramento, California, and another building closer to downtown that is also sitting in a corner, but there are guards and laws that keep those doors locked, and here I have the keys and freely let myself in and out of this building. So again, as you see, simply reducing all of this to the material is an extremely simplistic thing. And so the better conversation we should have is, what do we mean by gods? Well, what do we mean by reality? What do we mean by characters? What do we mean by agency? Now, in previous video, I talked about God number one and God number two. Now, I'm not saying that these are two different gods. I'm saying that these are two ideas about God and two notions about God. Now, Christianity, I believe the Christian God is both God one and God two, integrated into this is one God. Now God number one has the kind of power like Mickey Mouse to a certain degree. And this is exactly the point that Peterson has been making. This character that we call God governs reality. And in fact, the governance of reality of this character called God is a big part of what Sam Harris is protesting. The Disney Corporation is sort of like the church in that the Disney Corporation governs Mickey Mouse, and its priests are the writers and the graphic designers and the storytellers and the marketers. These are all the priests that govern the God Mickey Mouse. Now, tell Disney stockholders that Mickey Mouse doesn't exist, and in fact, they will get very angry, and they'll say, no, Mickey Mouse is the reason I buy Disney stock, and the reason I hold on to Disney stock, and the reason every time Congress, every time Mickey Mouse seems to be threatened to be pulled out of, pulled into public domain, there's a huge amount of power that is governing the status of Mickey Mouse. And this is not unlike what Jordan Peterson is trying to reveal about God number one, and this is part of what Sam Harris is protesting. But a big part of Jordan Peterson's point is that Sam Harris's imagination that you can simply get rid of this isn't that much different from imagining you can just get rid of Mickey Mouse. There are vested interests that very much are determined to keep Mickey Mouse the the property of the Disney Corporation. Now you might say, but God number 2, if you pray to Mickey, he won't answer you. Well, now we're talking about personhood. Well, if you pray to Mickey, and in fact, if enough people start praying to Mickey, the Disney Corporation might in fact pay attention, and the Disney Corporation may in fact answer some of the prayers that you are praying to Mickey if the Disney Corporation finds out the kinds of prayers that they are praying to Mickey, and the Disney Corporation determines that it's in their corporate best interest and it's in their financial best interest to, maybe through the Make-A-Wish Foundation, Mickey Mouse will fly into, a representation of Mickey Mouse will fly into a child's hospital room and shake Mickey's hand. Now, you're not going to find Mickey Mouse showing up at a rival theme park. He's not going to show up at Six Flags. Why not? Well, there's a lot going on here. And so Sam Harris says, yeah, but, we're playing games with this God idea. Are we? No, I think what Peterson is doing is forcing the conversation into really getting down with, what do we mean when we say God? There are various aspects to this. Now, I'm going to bring in another situation in this. There's Phil Vischer, who was the creator of Bob and Larry, Larry the Cucumber and Bob the Tomato. And if you want a good book to read about what happened to VeggieTales, you can read Phil Vischer's Me, Myself, and Bob, where he talks about, now he writes it as a Christian, and Phil Vischer very much saw his engagement with these fictitious characters of Bob and Larry very much in relationship to this God that he has. And that's very strongly a God number 2 approach. Phil Vischer has pretty solid evangelical credentials. And as I mentioned in my previous video, a lot of this transition between God number 1 and God number 2 happened in the 70s, the rise of evangelicalism. This, I think, is a result of what had been happening in the church in terms of the mainline church. In many respects, the mainline church is more deeply invested in God number 1, and the evangelical church is more deeply invested in God number 2. And it doesn't, again, I don't think it's a coincidence that Peterson was raised in some ways with a little bit of the context of God number 1 around him. Now, what's the relationship between Phil Vischer and Bob the Tomato? Well, why was it so devastating for Phil Vischer to lose Bob the Tomato in bankruptcy court? You might say, well, that's a funny thing. Well, Bob the Tomato is now governed by a different corporation, and Bob the Tomato is no longer, in a sense, governed by Phil Vischer. Now, Phil Vischer might still do voiceover work, but the scripts are being written by someone else. And even if that corporation decided they wanted Phil Vischer to write the scripts about Bob the Tomato, all of those scripts would have to be approved by the corporation, because Bob the Tomato is owned by a different corporation and no longer the property of Phil Vischer. Why? Because Phil Vischer didn't get particularly good legal advice when he was going up his status rocket, and when he wasn't able to successfully negotiate the transition from VHS to DVD to online, and they tried to expand to meet the anticipated VHS and DVD demand, they went bankrupt. They overextended, the movie cost too much, and again, it's a very interesting story. But what are the connections between Phil Vischer and Bob the Tomato? Well, these are some very real connections, and these connections are in fact legally recognized, and I don't think anyone out there would demand that these connections no longer be legally recognized. Now, you might say, well, I think of God number 1 as energy or a field. Well, C.S. Lewis shines a good light on that in his book Miracles, because this is a common thing. But you don't really get away from the questions by saying, well, God is a force, or God is an energy, or God is the sum of all things. And I'm reading from C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. At this stage, I must turn aside to deal with a rather simple-minded illusion. When we point out that what Christians mean is not to be identified with their mental pictures, some people say, in that case, would it not be better to get rid of the mental pictures and of the language which suggests them altogether? But this is impossible. People who recommend it have not noticed that when they try to get rid of man-like, or as we call them, anthropomorphic images, they merely succeed in substituting other kinds, images of other kinds. I don't believe in a personal God, says one. I do believe in a great spiritual force. What he has not noticed is that the word force has let in all sorts of images about winds and tides and electricity and gravitation. I don't believe in a personal God, says another, but I do believe we are all parts of one great being, capital B. Interesting. Which moves and works through us all, not noticing that he has merely exchanged the image of a fatherly and royal-looking man for the image of some widely extended gas or fluid. A girl I knew was brought up by higher-thinking parents in regard to God as a perfect substance. In latter life, she realized that this had actually led her to think of him as something like a vast tapioca pudding. To make matters worse, she disliked tapioca. We may feel ourselves quite safe from this degree of absurdity, but we are mistaken. If a man watches his mind, I believe he will find what professes to be specifically advanced or philosophic conceptions of God are, in his thinking, always accompanied by vague images which, if inspected, would turn out to be even more absurd than the man-like images aroused by Christian theology. And this is part of Peterson's point in his biblical series, where he says, to think about God as a father or God as a king actually makes a whole lot more sense than trying to turn God into energy or turn God into a force, because how this being is working in our midst has much more to do with, in fact, it has connections with these human relationships. Back to C.S. Lewis. For man, after all, is the highest of things we meet in a sensuous experience. He has, at least, now man he doesn't mean by male. C.S. Lewis is writing before we have this gender-inclusive language trend in writing. And man was understood to be male and female in the English language. He has at least conquered the globe, honored, though not followed, virtue, achieved knowledge, made poetry, music, and art. If God exists at all, it is not unreasonable to suppose that we are less unlike him than anything else we know. What he means by that is, would God be more like energy, or would God be more like us? Now, in fact, you look at mythology all over the world, and you will often find, well, Thor, well, he kind of looks like us. Aphrodite, she looks like us. The Hindu gods, they look like us. Well, what's going on? Well, Lewis and Peterson are, in a sense, making the same point that, this business about force and energy, you're really not thinking this thing through. No doubt we are unspeakably different from him, and to that extent all man-like images are false. And again, this is me again, when you contemplate, for example, the Ten Commandments, where God says, don't make an image of anything around you like me, and you think that through, that's a tremendously brilliant thing. Because the problem we have is that once we start imagining God in a certain way, whether it be like electricity or tapioca or a force, wind or gas or something like that, well, those images tend to bleed into our minds. And it's for this reason that people look at the Bible and say, oh, I can't believe that. It's actually a stroke of incredible genius for the Hebrew God to say to them, do this unlike every other nation you know. And in fact, this becomes a chief struggle throughout the history of the Old Testament, because they want to turn him into a golden calf. Well, why a golden calf? Well, actually, if you think about sacrifice and how cows have functioned throughout the history of the world where we've had domesticated cattle, cows are one of the safest investments you can make for your money. And so then, if you think about sacrifice and cows, well, a golden cow is not an absurd attempt to represent God. But God, the Lord, comes along to the Hebrews, as the story says, and says, don't represent me as anything in your world. And I often use the illustration, if you are a tremendous maker of pies, You wouldn't want to be represented by a pie because you are the maker of the pie, and you don't want people confusing you between that which you make and that which you are. So, again, back to Lewis, no doubt we are unspeakably different from him, and to that extent, I just looked at my phone to see if I got a text from my wife. I'll start again. No doubt we are unspeakably different from him. To that extent, all man-made images are false. But those images of shapeless mists and irrational forces which, unacknowledged, haunt the mind when we think we are rising to the conception of impersonal and absolute being, must be very much more so. For the images of one kind or the other will come. We cannot jump off our own shadow. And so Lewis is basically saying this modern conception of trying to get away from an anthropomorphic image really doesn't make much sense, and I would assert that it's probably betraying something. It's probably betraying, we have motivation for that, and this gets back into, if you've been listening to my videos, this idea of colonization that I picked up from Lewis in Miracles, that in fact we colonize the wind, we colonize the waters, we bottle gas, we employ all of this. And again, if you look at movies that like to trade in pantheistic conceptions of God, pay attention in those movies and how often you will notice that the personal agent attempts to employ the impersonal deity for the purposes of that personal agent. Use the Force, Luke, to destroy the Death Star. We're the God of the world of Avatar is fighting for us. Use the God to get what we want. Now, in fact, if you listen to my sermon Sunday, there's a deep sense of consumerism implicit within polytheism as practiced in paganism, because if your God can be employed, who finally is God? And that would be yourself. And this Christianity, I believe, exposes, because Christianity essentially says we are in a power struggle with God. We wish to be gods of the universe. We wish to be the God of the universe. And the biggest problem that we have with supposing that that position is already taken is that we don't have sufficient power to do so. So let's talk about the power of God. And I put God in quotes here because, again, I'm continuing to work Jordan Peterson's project from below about trying to understand this God. Sam Harris is objecting to the kind of power that God has similar to Mickey. Now, this is probably something that Harris will, as Brett Weinstein did in the first two lectures, they will cave in, and Brett Weinstein doesn't necessarily have a problem with Jordan Peterson's God, and he can understand how such a God could govern, in fact, how such a God could govern our behavior, and in fact, how prayers would, and I'll put work in. Because if you go back to my Hezekiah sermon, it's the specific type of situation that Harris is really protesting. Now, it would be interesting to see if Harris has as much problem with Luke Skywalker saying, use the Force, or Obi-Wan saying to Luke Skywalker, use the Force. Because in a sense, God 1 is much more like the Force, because many who look at God 1 say, well, this God doesn't have to be personal. This God doesn't have to have the kind of agency that all of us imagine human beings, including Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and Paul Vanderklay, as having. God's power is colonized by preachers, parents, and influencers. Now, let's use a sexual moray that at this point is nearly uncontested, and it seems like it's getting more and more difficult to find sexual moray. Well, I think that's actually not true. I think, as you can see in the university conversations about date rape, that there's in a sense, when we change the rules, we always change them in the other side to try to compensate, because we say, well, you don't need, we'll say it's not immoral for unmarried people to have sex. Well, okay. So then we'll say, well, it's not immoral for unmarried people to have sex if they consent. Okay. But now you throw alcohol into the midst, and suddenly, how clear must the consent be? Well, also, so then universities were teaching students, you must have verbal consent before passing to the next degree. Now, as you begin to pull this apart, you begin to realize, well, what really is the next degree? I'll be circumspect for younger ears that might be listening to my videos. We'll have first base, second base, third base, and a home run. Well, are all of us in agreement over what is the difference between first and second base? There's a classic moment in many relationships when one person says to the other person, I love you. And we all know, well, there's no physicality to those words, but we all know those words are powerful, and those words have power, and those words have power to govern, and those words are relational, and they have power to govern, but they are not the matter of one hand or one part of one person's body making contact with another person's body. And in fact, when you get into this entire area, you begin to realize that the entire debate over appropriate sexuality is all relational. Because it's not just about, well, bodies are considered, but it's also about what are the relationship between the two persons. And so again, when we talk about marriage, well, marriage is a relational situation governing other relationships, actions, and in fact, physical persons on down below it. And so in that sense, marriage is kind of like God number one. So here's an example of a sexual moray or a taboo. Same-sex siblings had better not have sex. Well, what do you mean by sex? Well, let's say we all know what we mean by sex. Now, the fear of opposite sex siblings having intercourse has for a long time been pregnancy. Now, Jonathan Haidt works on this. Well, there's my wife. I guess see what she's going to say. You didn't actually see it because I paused the video. But my marriage governed my fingers, and those fingers governed this computer. And my eyes, my wife just said she's eating chocolate for dinner. I better get home. You can see how this relational world governs things. Okay, and much more than, say, even the objective world. The relational world colonizes and governs. So, let's say, imagine same-sex siblings. Is it wrong for same-sex siblings to have sex, let's say? And obviously, they're not going to have male-female intercourse that could produce a child, but I won't go into all of the variety of things that we designate under this term sex between same-sex persons. Where is the harm? Now, you might say, well, there's psychological harm. Well, okay. Where does that psychological harm come from? Is it from a taboo that somehow in ways we sort of know but haven't talked about, because you almost never talk about this kind of thing, because everyone thinks it's wrong. If you learn that everyone thinks it's wrong, then you'll feel bad about yourself, and so on and so forth. So what's governing? And you might say, well, siblings have evolved not to do this. Okay, why? Have there been persons involved in this choice? Has there been the storyverse getting built into by hierarchies and all the things that Peterson talks about? Has that been built into all of this? And so, again, from a Petersonian perspective, you might say, well, let's call all of this stuff that has developed around all of these ideas and that, in fact, governs all of this behavior, let's call that God. Now, this isn't the kind of God that you will point to in the sky, but let's say that God is best represented as a judgmental father who says to his boys or his girls, don't have sex with each other. If you do, I'll punish you. And when they see them as little children, they'll give them a stern look or slap a hand away or something like that from a very early stage on. And then this families that don't do this, however story you want to put in this. But again, Peterson says this all gets built into God. Now we'll get to Sam Harris's objections to that later. But here's the problem that Sam Harris has. There's no clean room. Sam Harris might, in his mind, say, we can get rid of all of these stories, but that's just simply a figment of your imagination. You might imagine a wand out of Harry Potter getting rid of all of the supernatural tendencies, getting rid of Verizon Lisa, who imagines the universe is talking to him. This religious nature has been around us, and those who say, well, we don't need it anymore. Why do you think that? Can you demonstrate that? Can you demonstrate that scientifically? Can you demonstrate that rationally? And I would argue you're a long, long ways from it. It's mostly assertion. Is having sex with your same-sex sibling harmful only because of the history of moral condemnation? That history is like Santa or Mickey Mouse. It is in the society. Do you want to get rid of it? Do you think maybe we'd be healthier? So why don't you go ahead and have a bunch of children and raise them on an island or apart from all other human beings, and maybe feed the children more and encourage them to have do sexual things with each other from a very young age and grow them up. But here's the problem. You haven't been raised in that clean room either. And in fact, your desire to have all these children on an island and raise them with this new society is already tainted by the ideas that you brought to the island. In other words, everybody's got a belly button. You start from a story, and we have almost no idea the consequences of the quote-unquote God that we've been immersed in and that has been forming our society with all of its particularities. And so to simply at this point just wipe away and say all of this is wrong is, quite frankly, in my opinion, simply naive. Jordan Peterson makes the point that these moral histories are cumulative powers represented in stories that have real power psychologically. And in fact, just as a cat jumps away from a cucumber and monkeys are terrified of snakes, even if the monkey has never seen a snake, we don't know how much has been imprinted, hardwired into us from birth. This is Peterson's point, and he makes it over and over again. And so he keeps telling Sam Harris, this imagination that you can simply wipe this away is naive, because even if you wanted to run a grand experiment off, move everyone off Australia. Australia's been or let's say Tanzania or Madagascar, or find an island and run your test. Even setting up the test has all of this built into it. You have no clean room. In fact, even if you could take the memory wiping stick from Men in Black, or Persons in Black if we were to remake the movie, well, it's built into the DNA. Wipe the memory of an ape. You put that snake into the cage of a chimp that has never seen a snake. Bang, it reacts. You slide that cucumber next to that cat who has never seen a snake. Bang, it reacts. We don't know what's built in. And you might say, well, you're a pastor telling me this. This isn't from church. This is from Darwin. This is from science. This is why Peterson is rocking these cages. And again, Peterson isn't saying stuff that's debated. This is just given. And so you're just going to disavow us of this? Are you going to talk the monkeys out of being afraid of snakes? Are you going to talk the cats out of being afraid of cucumbers? Because here's the thing. I think it was McGilchrist says, a dog has about as many neurons as a human being has in their gut. We don't know what all is built into us. Now, put on my religious hat. Do I have a hat? Well, I guess I have my River Cats hat. Well, guess what? Theologians have been saying for a long time, God is built into us. St. Augustine, nothing can satisfy one who would not be satisfied with God. John Calvin, what does John Calvin say? Well, John Calvin says, the sensus divinitatis, that's Latin. This is built into us. So you can't see my eyes when I wear a cap, so I got to take my cap off. So, same-sex siblings having sex, they feel guilty, or maybe they don't. Or is that put onto them? Or shouldn't they be doing it? What is the harm? Well, here's the problem. We don't know. Now, just recently, this just came out August 1, Pew, who does a lot of studies, did a study, why Americans go to church or stay home. Number one reason, 81% of Americans who go to church or other religious services say very important reason for attending is to become closer to God. Well, that's interesting. It's obviously pretty psychological. Second reason, 69% say, so children will have a moral foundation. Now, this has got to drive Sam Harris nuts, because Sam Harris and the other celebrity atheists have been saying, you know, this is doing moral damage to children. Well, here's the difficulty. How much do we know about the damage? This has been practiced now for thousands of years. And parents, and I talk to many people who say, I went to church as a kid. My parents sent me there. They didn't even go with me. Now, do studies with psychologists, and they'll tell you, when whole families went to church together, it tended to stick more with the kids. When the kids just went alone, didn't quite stick as much. And so actually, the bigger determiner of whether or not your children are going to practice religion is whether the parents continue to practice religion. Why? Because what we do is more important and, in fact, imprints more deeply into our children than the words we say. Now, why would that be? Well, Peterson says we're watching each other. Well, what happens when we're watching each other? Well, our conscious mind is about this big, but our watchers are there, and they're watching, and they're imprinting, and they're taking it in. And, well, we learn this if you're a parent of any kind. There's no clean room with parenting. And even those who say they didn't like how their parents parent, how do they start the script? By taking the parent script and reversing it. In other words, there's no clean room. It's for or against, but there's a structure. There's something they're working from. And this is true about us with nearly about everything. And this is one of the things that the psychologists began to realize, and why the psychologists will sit down and listen to you talk. And at some point, it's going to come back to childhood, because you were deeply formed before you had any idea that you was a you. And in fact, this goes back generations. The decisions made by your ancestors have governed you in ways that you don't even know. So last night we had our Jordan Peterson meetup, and we had the biggest meetup ever. We had 25 people show up. These are those willing to have their picture taken. Some don't like to have their picture taken. Some don't want to be associated with this. So I always say, if you're willing, like to have your picture taken, they do. So we had our Jordan Peterson meetup, and it was very interesting, because we had the meetup on Sunday. This is our weekend, once a month weekend Sunday. We have a midweek Sunday once a month, a midweek meeting too once a month. But on Saturday, I had gone to a bar mitzvah of a student. My wife is a school teacher. In her class, had a bar mitzvah, and I was talking to another parent, and the parent was reflecting on his own childhood, how this person wasn't raised with any religion at all, and he was quite impressed by the ceremony of the bar mitzvah, and seeing the generations of people and the formation of a child, and seeing the values and all of that built in and expressed through the ceremony. And this parent said, I wonder if I've missed out on something. I wonder if I've missed out on giving my children something. And one of the things that people say, well, churches are full of old people. Now, part of this is, in fact, because of the curve of religiosity that's going on through American culture, and American church attendance reached its peak during the Cold War, as I've mentioned in many movies. But a large part of this is because people, when they get into their 60s and 70s, start to think about this more deeply, and they begin to appreciate the fact how we are formed, how we are constructed, and begin to appreciate the fact that we are making decisions based on what feels good at the moment. Or the older you get, you begin to make decisions based on, I've got more experience. And the older you get, and the more you begin to remember past generations, you start realizing that you really want a far larger time frame from which to gather your experiences and information and data in order to make better decisions. One person, in fact, came to the meeting and was talking about the fact that she noticed a grandson had zero religious formation. And she said something to the fact of, I need a mythology. I don't even care that it's real. And many people are recognizing now that this lack of a religious system that they were raised in has not afforded them a framework from which to actually engage the larger questions of life. Now, you can read books. So I cleaned my office. My office is clean. But you can read books from Houston Smith about Islam, or from Karen Armstrong about the Buddha, and you can learn these things, but that's a different thing from being in it. And Peterson rightly says, now growing up a Buddhist in Japan is a very different thing. And last night, actually, there were a couple of individuals who grew up in the Middle East. One grew up in an Islamic society, and another grew up in an Orthodox Christian group within an Islamic society. And it's fascinating talking to both of those individuals, because you very quickly realize that our view of religion in the West is Western, and the rest of the world doesn't see any of this way. And all of this imagined objectivity that we bring to these conversations and rationality, this is intensely constructed from where we grew up. And again, this leads me to think that so often some of these conversations are just incredibly naive. The idea that you can choose your religion, a number of these individuals, they just laugh at that. Say, you're not choosing anything. It's already baked into you, man. It was baked. It got started being baked into you by the choices of your parents and the decisions of your ancestors, your parents, your great-parents, your great-great-grandparents. All of these are baked into you. All of the decisions that they made. So you're playing with words. And so now Americans are feeling, I need to have something, and I don't know what to think about it, and I'm trying to work it through. And in walks Jordan Peterson, and lights start going on, and they start saying, I want to talk to someone that has a different experience. I want to talk to someone that knows something. I need to figure this out. Well, how do you make it real? Well, Santa and the Tooth Fairy gets made real by the parents' behaviors. Mickey is made real by Disney lawyers. Mickey can take your money and your freedom. Parents and the church make God real because it educates the kids into the stream of civilization. And that's probably at heart of Peterson's point. But now Peterson doesn't go to church. And will he go to church? Peterson is in a sense saying, again, to the dismay of Dillahunty and Harris, you're a Christian. And if you talk to the folks from the Middle East, they'll say, duh, yeah, but you're Western Christian. And that's a very different thing from Eastern Christian or Muslim or Eastern Buddhist or Eastern Hindu. You don't just choose to be a Buddhist like someone who grew up in Japan or China. That's not how it works. Just like if you grew up in the middle of the Islamic world, you'll be very different. And now Harris wants to rail against that. And it's like, all right, rail against gravity. What are you going to do? Kill them all? Find your clean room? It doesn't seem to me to be a very productive way of approaching people. So we don't need these made-up stories. Really? How are you going to stop it? Do you know which stories to stop? Now, when these are finally released, you'll hear Sam Harris talk about his daughters. Now, I'm not saying anything about his daughters. We're going to treat his daughters in an abstract way, but little girls dressing up as Batgirl or Batwoman or Wonder Woman, well, their gods are real enough to impact their behavior, probably in ways we don't understand. Now, we might say, well, these aren't really gods, or are they? Well, what is a god? Is Mickey Mouse a god? Is Santa a god? Is Thor a god? Is Wonder Woman, Diana, is she a god? Well, what is a god? That's the conversation we're having. And we're noticing that in some ways Mickey Mouse and Bob the Tomato are sort of like God aspect one that Jordan Peterson is talking about. But so is, and Peterson pursues this a bit in the conversation, so are these. And Sam Harris might say, well, I'm not raising my daughters to become religious. Well, I think you're going to have to be more careful. Well, what are the cultural priests doing to these girls? Why all the excitement about strong female characters? Now, one of the things that I've noticed is that in all of this, the priests of the gods that are Wonder Woman or Batgirl or Superman or Thor or Iron Man or Mickey Mouse or Bob the Tomato or any of these characters that these children are playing, these characters are being created by the priests, as it were, and they are forming the children. And nobody will disagree with that. Even the secularists say, well, we need more strong female, we need better representation in movies because we know this is imprinting on the young. We're not playing religious games with this. This, to me, is completely religious. It's not really a lot different from parents sending their kids to school. And in fact, the religious communities for years have been wringing their hands about these things and asking questions, should we let our children go see Harry Potter? Well, there's magic in Narnia too. Should we let our kids, well, Tolkien was a Christian, so Tolkien and Lewis tend to get a pass. Harry Potter, not always so much. Star Wars, not always so much. Christians have been dealing with this, and a lot of other Christians have been saying we don't want our children seeing these Disney movies. Well, now the left, which has gotten very religious, is saying, well, these Disney princesses are bad. We don't want our little girls dressing up like princesses. This is all religion. This is the same thing. This is not very much different from church. And part of what's interesting about this conversation is that these strong female role models tend to be masculine. Wonder Woman fights and beats men at a rather masculine approach to negotiation. Women have used feminine approaches to negotiation, which tend to be asymmetrical. And I'll often make the case, who is stronger, a beautiful woman or a strong man? My argument is a beautiful woman using feminine strength is far stronger than one strong man because that beautiful woman can colonize the minds of a number of strong men and, in fact, subdue the one strong man. Female power is enormous. Feminine power is enormous. Why? Because it colonizes. Okay? And again, go back to the C.S. Lewis Miracles conversation about colonizing. The beautiful woman with feminine powers colonizes the man. And although he's physically larger and stronger, she now employs his strength to her will. You can watch last week's Sunday school class when I talked about Cupid. Well, what is happening there? Is it a spirit? Well, that's the way the Greeks talked about it, and that, in a sense, is the way the second epistle of John talks about. Well, the first epistle of John talks about the spirit of Antichrist. Well, what do you mean by there? What about the spirit of love? Well, now we're dealing with anthropology, and we're dealing with metaphor, and we're dealing with that which governs. And again, the point Peterson is making is God aspect one governs this world in ways that Sam Harris simply has no power to dispel. In fact, Sam Harris can't even keep religion away from his daughters. Now, Sam Harris looks at that and says, my daughter dressing up as Wonder Woman is not religious. And I say again, you're naive. Is Wonder Woman real? Real enough to have those images and to have her ethics and to have these ideas colonize your daughter, and the priests of the DC universe are colonizing your daughter. Is Wonder Woman real? DC thinks it's real. Real enough to have lawyers. My girls don't pray to Wonder Woman. Well, maybe they are now. Maybe you say, well, they'll outgrow that. And as a pastor, I have to say, really? Because what I find is that adults, even those who say they don't believe in God, they'll talk to the universe about Verizon phones. And again, this is what people do. Oh, but aren't they learning to be like Wonder Woman? Aren't the qualities, the masculine strength that Wonder Woman exists, aren't those qualities being ranked in your daughter's hierarchies and being baked into her neural pathways to the degree that she is going to be dealing with these her whole life long? Now you might say, well, these are the ones I want. Okay, how do you know that they're good? Well, because here's the funny thing. Whenever we talk about morality, we don't say enslaving people based on the color of their skin is only sometimes good. We say it's always wrong. And so we are going to condemn George Washington and Thomas Jefferson for those wrongs. Okay. But notice what we're doing when we're talking about morality. We're saying it's always wrong. Well, how do you know that it's always wrong? Well, I know morality. Well, how do you know morality? You might see my sermon from last Sunday because I got into that at that point. You're in a sense saying you're going to get outside of time and get outside of context and make a determination about it. Well, how? What clean room? Now, what moral clean room can you stand within to make your judgment about Wonder Woman and whether or not she's good or she's right? Isn't that the point of representation in that entire conversation? Isn't this establishing a moral narrative for the girls to live out their whole life? Now, how tested are these gods? See, now we're getting into some really deep things, because the ideas of, now we're getting into the word archetype will come up at this point. Because these patterns have been going on throughout history using different features. We are confident in our tools of science to orient ourselves. Really? In terms of behavior? We're more confident in terms of objects in space, but as we saw at the very beginning of this video, that the governing sphere seems to be form for action. And our tools of psychology that a lot of people imagine govern morality, which I would assert they don't, and go ahead and watch The Sopranos, which dealt with this issue. These tools are just a few generations old. Freud is not that long ago. Jung is more recent. He died in the 40s. Psychology isn't 200 years old, and you're going to base your morality on that. What you're probably doing are taking your presuppositions and trying to employ psychology as Luke tries to use the Force in order to get the outcomes you desire. But where do those outcomes come from? I made the point in the meetup that, listen to Tom Holland and N.T. Wright in The Unbelievable talk about the moral assumptions of the Roman Empire. And Tom Holland, who is a historian writing books about the Roman Empire, he's aghast at the cruelty of the Roman Empire. If you had status as a Roman man, you could have sex with whatever, whenever you wanted. And I mentioned that, you mentioned Nero. Nero finding a political rival and raping that person in the street as a political act. Do you think sex in prison is all about sex, or is it about status and power? Well, and, Donald Trump and Chuck Schumer. I won't say what I said at the meetup, but you get the image. Now, today, this is unthinkable to us. Why? Well, because Christianity's been around for 2,000 years. And we've got all of these developed moral ideas that say persons ought to be respected. And so you can have any religion you want as long as it doesn't harm another person. But this business about harm gets difficult because, again, well, is Wonder Woman harming our young girls? Are Disney princesses harming our young girls? Is Mickey Mouse harming our children? Well, the priests of the Disney Corporation are really the priests. So we are confident in our tools of science to orient our behavior. These tools are a few generations old. We spent a long time burning fossil fuels before there might be global warming. And figuring out what CO2 might do in the atmosphere is a whole lot simpler than figuring out what representation in the media, which is also very new, is doing to us. Jordan Peterson's point is that we want to appropriate knowledge on a far larger scale, which is exactly why he looks at mythology and religion, because that's where we actually have records kept, and that's where we actually look at story and behavior, and that's where we actually get a sense of what people not only a few decades or a few hundred years, but a few thousand years ago thought. And so in a sense, what Peterson is trying to do is orient ourselves. And he's saying, if you orient yourselves over the last couple of hundred years, you're really driving blind. If you drive in the fog and you can only see 5 feet ahead of your car and you say, I know what's out there, you only see 5 feet. And if you're traveling 60 miles an hour, and I would argue the pace of change is speeding up, we are traveling 100 miles an hour through 10-foot visibility fog. That is how we're navigating, but we're doing it. We built this car. We really know what we're doing. And Peterson basically comes along and says, I don't think so. And religious people are coming along and saying, you have no idea. Because we've been telling these stories and having these conversations for hundreds of years. And we're in the same moment you are, but we're also listening to the past in a way that Sam Harris wants to simply dismiss. Now, what if Sam's daughter started dressing like Elsa? Well, who's Elsa? Well, watch the Indiana Jones movie with the Holy Grail, and Elsa is this seductress that Indiana and his father have both made moves on, but she is a Nazi spy. So, how do we evaluate Elsa? We have a little image of her here, don't we, with a little action figure. You start looking at these things, and we dress like them. You start looking at these things, and you start doing a little bit of history, and you look at ancient temples, and you say, we're kind of doing the same thing. And this is probably most clear with Wonder Woman. And you look at Wonder Woman's backstory. The story relates that she was sculpted from clay by her mother, Queen Hippolyta, and given life by Aphrodite, along with supernatural powers as gifts by the Greek gods. In recent years, DC changed her background with the revelation that she's the daughter of Zeus and Hippolyta. Boy, those Greek myths sure didn't go very far. But what did Zeus do? Well, Zeus didn't act that much different from Nero. So the Greek gods, which the Romans appropriated from the Greeks and gave their own little twists, did the stories of Zeus impregnating all kinds of women. What does that teach those at the top of the Roman hierarchy? Did they realize they were being taught by this? Does Sam Harris's daughter realize how Wonder Woman or Batgirl, what she's learning from them? Well, we just brought her up again, didn't we? Well, how tested are these gods? Well, again, back to Peterson. It's a far larger scale. Now we look at Wonder Woman and say, well, is Wonder Woman, how does she relate to the beauty myth? Because she's gorgeous. What if Wonder Woman looked like a bodybuilder instead of a model? Well, nobody would pay to see her. Well, what's going on? Well, why do we all want to see this beautiful woman who's got long flowing hair and stronger than men and fighting for the right? And this is what we're doing, aren't we? This is all religious. How in charge are we of these characters? In less than 100 years, these characters take on a life of their own, especially once they slip into public domain. Disney's really trying hard, and they're going to try and keep Iron Man and all these Marvel figures. Now, Thor's a little harder because, well, but watch what Disney has done. Didn't Disney? Well, look at Pinocchio. Look at The Lion King. Look at Sleeping Beauty. When Disney took these stories, they took them out of public domain because, well, what does Peterson say? You watched Maps of Meaning. You watched Personalities. These are archetypal stories. What does that mean? It means we're doing religious things all the time. Say, well, not supernatural things. We'll get back to God too. Don't worry. And Peterson again is just telling Sam Harris, you're really not paying attention here, Sam. And you're not even paying attention to your daughters as they get religious right under your nose. Well, they're not praying to Wonder Woman. How do you know? What is a prayer? If your daughters get scared, do they, I've seen kids do this, do they put on their Wonder Woman costume? Do they act like they have magic bracelets? And you might say, well, why are his daughters acting that way? It's imprinting, baby. It's imprinting. C.S. Lewis says, if you want to be an atheist, you got to be real careful about what you read. And now, what you see and what you let your kids see. Christians have understood this. And again, conservative Christians have been the ones that have been most careful about what their children see. Why? Because religious people have an understanding, even if they can't articulate it very well, how this stuff works. Well, we didn't know psychology, but long before we had psychology, embedded in religion was an implicit knowledge of all of this. Wasn't it the monks that said, give me a child until they're 6 and I'll have them for the rest of their life? The government's figuring this out. Less than 100 years, these characters take on a life of their own. New writers take the story in a new direction. People debate the morality of the old and new stories, and we see this all the time. We have to have politically correct Batman, and go ahead and look at older comic books and watch older representations of Superman and Wonder Woman, and watch how we twist them morally, and watch how the new priests update it, and well, what happens with all this updating? Well, this is not in some ways different from many of the conversations that you read in the Bible. Now, again, there's a lot of misconception from people about what's in the Bible. Well, I think the Bible's a book of rules telling us how to behave. No, hardly at all. There are rules in the Bible. There are laws in the Bible, but there's narrative in the Bible, and there's poetry in the Bible, and the Bible is working through all of these things. Then how do you understand it? And this is what the church has been doing with story ever since there's been a church. They are retreads. These comic book stuff, these are just retreads of old stories, just like Disney has done, just like we keep doing. Well, why? Well, because these stories work, the Darwinian approach to stories. Now Sam Harris will say, come on. Do we pray to these gods? What do you mean by prayer? Do you worship them? What do you mean by worship? Do you act out what these gods do? Did the Caesars act out the gods of the pantheon? How you stand with respect to them may determine how others see you. And I would argue this line isn't very thick. Jordan Peterson's argument for God from sacrifice, basically, which is we saw that those who could delay gratification prospered. Well, who delays gratification? I remember watching, I think it was Susie Orman on TV, telling people, give away a certain percentage of your money, like 10%. Why? Because then you have power over your money and it doesn't have power over you. Well, that's interesting. Churches have been telling their people to do this for a very long time. Now, did they give it a psychological reason? No. Well, what is the real reason? Does the psychological representation of the reason actually exhaust the truth of the reason all the way on down? Well, you don't know that. Because what Peterson would say would be that, well, offering the sacrifice rehearses, let's put it in psychological terms, reinforces the neural pathways by which a person can delay gratification and not eat their seed corn, even when the supply is getting low. They're delaying gratification, but they're preserving that best corn for the next season so they have something to harvest. So those who sacrifice prosper, and those who don't. In Jordan Peterson's Easter videos, this essentially, and then my commentary on them, this essentially is his argument for God 1. Well, what about God 2? Is there a God 2 that blesses those? Peterson will say, I don't know. But it sure seems as if that's what's happening. Is that good enough? Good enough for you to believe? Now let's get back to Phil and Bob, and again bring in Dorothy Sayers and her book, The Mind of the Maker. Does Bob express his creator? Yeah. In fact, if you look at Bob and Larry, there's a lot of Phil Vischer in Bob and Larry, and the representations that Phil created of Bob, well, he voices him. And in fact, I would argue that probably a good shrink sitting down with Phil and talking about Bob and Larry would find that Bob and Larry are parts of Phil. And in fact, if you don't even need a shrink, just talk to probably Phil's wife and say how much Bob is in Phil and how much Larry is in Phil and how much of these other creatures are in Phil, and his wife would probably laugh and say, Phil is full of them. Well, what are we? Are we sure there is no maker? Because again, to imagine simplistically, well, we're looking for an object. We're looking for God to be an object. First of all, we see that God 1 is all over the place. And again, Peterson has this argument 1. It's practically undeniable. But then Harris says, well, I want to know if there's an agent more like Phil Vischer. And Jordan Peterson says, those who act as if there is tend to prosper. And he'll stop short of ontology. And that's where we tend to get into the resurrection, because, and I'll talk about this in further videos, what we want to know is, does God 2, can I actually have a relationship with God? Is this a personal God? Does having a relationship with this God make sense? Now, this is where God 1 and 2 are really coming together, because in a sense, when Jordan Peterson says, those who sacrifice prosper, they're acting as if they're having a relationship with this God. And they seem to be prospering. So, how do you know? Well, I don't believe it because there could be something supernatural. Well, who is more real, Phil Vischer or Bob the Tomato? Well, Phil Vischer is more real. Why? Because Phil Vischer made Bob the Tomato. It would be a very strange thing if we were the most real thing. In fact, again, the most real Paul Vanderklay is not actually this body that's sitting here. It seems to be this story that is producing these videos rather than just this body. This story and this agent that is Paul Vanderklay within this consciousness is moving the hands and controlling the computer and colonizing the internet, and my words are colonizing you. So is there a real Paul Vanderklay? I tend to find the denial of God aspect 2 Number one, it's unprovable, which most will agree. But most of human history hasn't had a problem with it. So what's the problem with it for the celebrity atheists? Given the ubiquity and power of God number one, it's hard to see how the addition of the number two reality fills skeptics with so much fear, unless it perhaps is motivated. Because here's the thing, we want, use the force, Luke, we want God number one to be employable. But the real problem we have with God number two is such a being is not employable by us. Such a being can say no to us. Such a being can do with us what it wills to a greater degree than a tsunami can do with us what it wills, or to a greater degree than a hurricane can, or an asteroid can, or even the results of our own stupidity. We can't even control God number one. And what's really interesting is that I don't want to go to church, or I don't want to be part of formal religion, but I really like the idea of using the force. What is that in you? That's your religious, that's your ambitious religious ego. And what's really interesting about the desire for there to be an impersonal God is all you expose is that you would like to have the power of the universe at your disposal. You would like to be God. Now, in my Sunday school class a couple of weeks ago, I asked, what would it be? How would you know if someone was a son of God? Well, if they could boom out of thin air, create a pile of cash in the middle of the classroom. Okay. So that would be, to bring wealth. Okay, well, Jordan Peterson's sacrifice, delaying gratification, bringing wealth. It's not supernatural. But again, how would we see the supernatural? When Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes, all we see are differences in pattern. It wasn't glowy bread. It was just a difference in the pattern. And even manna, there's a lot of debate. What was this manna? In fact, the word manna means, what is it? And well, we see a difference in the pattern. Okay. But now you get into Christianity, and again, going back to Charles Taylor and the secular age, with the step of providential deism. You can go back and look at my video that I did about that. The step of providential deism, where we kind of say, well, the universe is running itself. Okay. Well, why do we like that? Well, when the universe is running itself, Taylor has his water bottle. I can't use it anymore. I'll have to use the tape dispenser. Or I can use my water bottle. Oh, I didn't put it by me. The universe is running itself. Then we can employ it. Then we can colonize it. Then we can take charge of it. Then I and my desires and what I want can have power over it. That's the desire of Sam Harris's children. That's the desire in my heart. That's the desire in all of our hearts. Well, why don't we want God number two? Thomas Nagel says it very well. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want there to be a God that says no. I don't want there to be a God who determines what happens to me. And you see the fiction of control. You didn't determine your genetics. You didn't determine the family you were born into. You didn't determine the country you were born into. You didn't determine the moment of history you were born into. We have this fantasy of controlling things. We can control some things, and we have agency. I totally believe that. But it's all built within a history. It's all built within a system. And it's completely wrapped in God's stories. All the way from the ground up. So the denial of God number two is of course unprovable. Most of human history hasn't had a problem with it. Given the ubiquity and the power of God one, it's hard to see how the addition of number two reality fills a skeptic with so much fear. Well, unless it's motivated. And of course, as a Christian, I say we're better off noting that denying God two is probably about pride. If there is a God aspect to, a personal God that is actually all good, in fact, has a better capacity for moral judgment than we have, because we know how fallible human capacity. Well, we think, well, my judgment is great. Well, again, we're back to the delusion that I could be God. and that Paul Vanderkay can determine what's right and wrong in every circumstance based on my little 55 years of living. Oh, well, I'll be really smart and use reason. Way to go. The people in the Middle East look at me and say, you're just a Westerner. You don't know anything. I say, no, I know more than you because we're more powerful than you. We see how constructed all this stuff is. If there is God aspect too, it is actually all good, has a better capacity to judgment than us, and all powerful, the universe is a happier place. And then suddenly we're going to say, well, how can I align myself with this God? Because I would not like to be his enemy. I would rather be his friend. And now I get into the conversation I had with my Sunday school class 2 weeks ago. Here's the crazy thing about Christianity. Jesus not only says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the author of creation. I am the Logos. He says, I will give you my power. What? You will give me your power? Yeah. If you live like me and die like me, you will reign like me over a new creation. Read the rest of the Book of Miracles. The Book of Miracles by C.S. Lewis. And I should get back to that. There have been so many interesting other ideas for videos. I keep getting distracted. There's so many interesting things. So, here we are. What do you mean you will give me power? Well, Acts 1. Stay in Jerusalem and the Holy Spirit will give you power. Power to be bold, but also power to be in submission to the Father. Power to see your own sin. This isn't the kind of power we usually want. We can easily see everybody else's sin. The Holy Spirit gives us power to see our own sin. What does that mean? The problem we have is that this makes claim on us that our hearts resent. Heidelberg Catechism says we have a natural tendency to hate God and our neighbor. And I think a big part of that resentment is their resistance to our efforts to colonize them. Just watch a child. The child tries to colonize the parent. The parent says, ha, I got you beat. I've been around longer than you. Then you get married. You try to colonize your beloved. First you fall in love and you submit like crazy. And then the more those glasses come off, the more the relationship develops. And guess what? You want to change your partner to have them be in your image. And your partner says, no, I wanted you to change to be in my image. And the one person says, no, but I'm right. And the other person says, no, but I'm right. We have a natural tendency to hate God and our neighbor. We have a natural tendency to hate God and our beloveds. Well, sort of work it out with those that we love, or we split up. Here's the difficulty we have with God. He might be a little smarter than your spouse, or your spouse might be a little smarter than you. Chances are you're fairly evenly matched, and sometimes you win and sometimes the other one. And if you're smart, you'll learn to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, the book of Ephesians. And you'll learn how to make the marriage work. Here's the problem with God. Well, he's way too smart. He knows way too much. He's got way too much power. We are no match. Your arms are too short to box with God, as the old saying goes. So then, what is the rational thing to do? Why don't you try submitting? Why don't you try believing? That would be my recommendation. But again, we've talked about the fact that you don't just believe because you choose to believe. Well, now we're realizing that, in fact, if we even want to believe, we're going to have to colonize ourselves. Well, what is the part that's colonizing ourselves? See, that's why this is fun. All right, this video's gone on long enough. Hope it was helpful. Sorry I haven't had a lot of time lately to engage in the comments. I'm just getting busier and busier. So, yeah, I know some of you said, oh, you're going to go up the hierarchy and you won't have time for us anymore. I really hope that doesn't happen, but we'll see what happens.